Hi, I'm Andrew Newman. I'm chair in Islamic and Persian at the University of Edinburgh, where I've been since the 1990s. I've been asked to say a few words about my first book, The Formative Period of Twelver Shi'ism, Hadith as Discourse Between Qom and Baghdad. I got interested in it for a variety of reasons, one of which was the question prevalent in Western language Islamic studies before the revolution and after the revolution about the authenticity of both prophetic but also the Imam's hadiths, a question in which I am profoundly not interested. But a lot of the writers were, and my question was taking it as authentic in the mind of the compiler. That's why the compiler chose to put that particular text in there. I was also interested not in, again, as related to the authenticity issue, not in the Imam in whom the Esnad ended, but rather the narrator from whom the compiler got the text in question. Here I'm talking about three main texts, Barqi's al-Muhassin, Safar al-Ghumi's Basair, and Kulayni's al-Kafi. So I was interested then in the narrator from whom each of these individuals got the text and from whom that person got it, the first two. And what I was trying to do was then look at the body of the texts and look at the body of the texts as a function of the compiler's particular concerns with the state of the community as he saw it at the time where he was. So you're looking at al-Barqi, so I talked a little about who he was and what we understood about him, Safar al-Ghumi, and then Kulayni. My take on this is that there was an infinite number of the Imam's hadiths extant and available at the time. We could never figure out how many that was. But each of the compilers chose from that body of text the texts he wanted to put in his particular compilation in response to both particular communal issues, but also personal questions that he had, and to try and get the balance of those things right. And that would be done by looking at the text that had been included on particular subjects. These are very different kinds of books. Al-Kafi and al-Muhassin, to the extent that we have access to bits of al-Muhassin, we don't have the whole thing, were more jurisprudential sorts of things, fiqh and furu', whereas Basair is a different kind of a text. But nevertheless, they were the responses of the compilers to particular sets of circumstances. So my interest was to look at the book and see what I could deduce about the circumstances from the book, from the different texts. And that's what I tried to do, avoiding neatly, I think, this question of authenticity, which I think is a problem that had long preoccupied Oriental studies, using this in the pejorative term, for many years at this. It was often said to me as I was starting to work out on this, and it was said to me when I was doing my own work in graduate school and such, oh, everybody knows these texts were all made up. To which my response was, well, you're an academic who's saying this, give me some examples and prove that they were made up. To which the response was again, well, everybody knows it. And I found that unsatisfying as an academic. So I decided to ask a different question. That's my take, generally speaking, on this particular text. And as the rule I've followed in all of my subsequent kind of ask a different question and you get a different answer. Ask the same question again, and you're going to get a variant of the same answers you used to get. And the role of the academic is not to repeat stuff. The role of the academic is to ask different kinds of challenging questions and come up with new and original takes on the extant literature based on those different kinds of sources or different kinds of approaches, methodologies, or some combination of both. To that time, the Basair and al-Muhassin had not really been examined all that much in English. This book was published, I apologize, I'm going to have to look, 2000. So if you cast your mind back to the 80s and 90s in particular, those two works were not very well known. They're obviously better known 20 years plus on. The same with al-Kafi is better known. But at the time, I was able to give a summary of the extant scholarship on these three works in a few pages because that's what there was. and then go on to look at them in different kinds of ways. So that was my initial interest. What I found was that as I understood the circumstances, in the changing circumstances in which each of the compilers was working, their responses, as gauged by the texts they chose to include in their compilations, were really quite different. So you could learn something about the circumstances from their personal points of view, where they were at the time. So there's a little bit of biography. In this case, there's a little bit of history of the city of Qom, which again, until that time, had not been in English all that much discussed, and a little bit more on the Shia in Baghdad, again, which to that time had not been all that much discussed, along with biographies. And you saw that in Al-Muhassin, in Basair, and also to an extent in Al-Kafi, the compilers were portraying the faithful as much less willing to accommodate themselves to the political establishment and much more wary of contact with the political establishment. So here you're talking about the rise of Baghdad and the aftermath of the Abbasids coming in, and the Abbasid Caliphate, which had some Shia there, and true, it was notionally a Shi'i, based on Shi'i kind of discourse and such. But really by that time it had become the political establishment. And so if you look at all three were based in Qom. Now it's true that Khomeini came to Baghdad and compiled, so we are told, Al-Kafi in the last years of his life when he was in Baghdad. But his response to what he saw in Baghdad, that's my argument, was based on text collected in Qom. How do you know this? You know this by the people from whom he got those texts. And I did the percentages and stuff in the book and found out that an awful large number of the texts that Khomeini had collected across all 8 volumes, right? So that includes the first 2 volumes as well, which were not always so well discussed, but also the latter fiqh, Furu' volumes, which were very under-discussed up until that period of time. The same narrators, same handful of narrators, were the points of origin for Khomeini for an awful lot of these texts right across the board, regardless of the particular topic and regardless of whether it was in the first 2 volumes, the more kalami, if you will, or theological stuff, and the jurisprudence, as well as the 8th volume, which is kind of the Rawza, which is a different kind of thing in particular. So you found Khomeini including texts, some of which were also available in Muhassin, of standing up to the political establishment, of a reticence to become involved with the political establishment, as a community waiting for the return of the Imam, which was judged to be imminent. There's a large discussion in there of the signs of returning of the Imam. And remember that the Imam had disappeared at a very young age, not so many years before, so it was in the normal lifetime of a human being to reappear at any stage. And up to about that point, before the arrival of the Buyids in the area, it would seem that, as reflected in Al-Kafi, portions of the community believed that the Imam was going to come back pretty quickly. Basair's is a different sort of a text, but there is much more a sense in there, I think, of the supernaturalness of the Imams, which is a lot talked about in Al-Kafi and to some extent what remains of Al-Muhassin. But there it was personified, embodied by these kinds of texts. And that portrayed the Imams in ways that would have reinforced believers' faith at the time, even as, practically speaking, by the Abbasids, they were being challenged in Qom all the time. There were constant demands on the Qawmis to deliver up taxes and do this and do that. Baghdad would get cross when things weren't done the way they wanted to have them done. So they were an encircled, embattled Shi'i city in the midst of a largely Sunni majority, with Baghdad not too far away at the hands of really a Sunni political establishment. So what is a Safar doing? A Safar is rallying the troops, saying, look, we're right, right is on our side here, even if we don't have the might to do that. Nevertheless, we are the repository. We're holding on to the true faith within that. Khomeini then extended that to a sense of jurisprudence, that we have a distinctive body of jurisprudence which makes us who we are. We are not the other different groups. In Iran, in particular, that would have been Zaydis and to some extent Ismailis, and Sunnis to some extent in Baghdad, but also in Baghdad at the same time, the Nawabkhtis, who were very friendly with the state, and Khomeini's texts were a rejoinder implicitly, if not explicitly, to that kind of relationship with the political establishment. No, this is not the right thing to do. We don't do that. We pay attention to what the imams have to say on issues. And if the imam is coming back pretty soon, then we wait. We adopt a sense of waiting until we come back, at which point our true faith, our affirmation of that faith, our holding fast to it, will be reaffirmed and confirmed when the Mahdi returns. So that's kind of where I see that work at that point. I've done some stuff on the Safavids in the last few years since this book. A book on the Safavids published in 2006. Another book which appears to be an introduction to Twelver Shi'ism, published from Edinburgh University Press in 2013, but is not really an introduction. So there are some arguments made there, I think from the point of view of believers on the day who would have been unsure, needing affirmation and confirmation, constantly challenged by other Shi'i groups as well as by Sunnis across the time up through the Buyid period, up through into the early Safavid period. And how do people then reinforce and commit, stay truthful to this in the midst of challenge? And again, I think that the faith has always been in the minority, and even in the early Safavid period, the faith remained in the minority until the later 17th century, when the infrastructure and the ulama sorts of structure were then in place in Iran. But up until that time, really this was a minority faith. And so under that kind of challenge, how do people respond? And how do they hold on to that faith? How do they understand it? I think the texts that we use for that period between the arrival of the Seljuks in Baghdad and the Shah Ismail's capture of the city of Tabriz in the very early Safavid period, the juncture when the Shia did not have a home, as it were, are the texts of certain well-known figures, the same handful of figures. If you look at those texts in a different kind of way, this other book was saying, and you try and deduce what the audience was and what was going on in the audience's minds in terms of their faith, as embodied in those texts, you then see those people, those figures, indeed also trying to react to these questions about belief and faith and such when the faith is scattered, when scattered all over the region, in the minority, sometimes under siege, challenged by living with other kinds of Shiite groups in the Sunni majority and the Sunni political establishment. So the idea was to see the text in a different way, to look at it as a response to a situation which one can define or attempt to define. So get the text, but then see what it is a response to, and try and infer what it is that is going on the ground such that this particular individual wrote this particular text. If you look at Alamea Hilli, for example, wrote an awful lot of Furu'a fiqh sort of stuff. In some of these books, his views are different. Now, if in the subsequent generations some of those volumes go missing, and somebody comes up and says, well, I have Hilli's view on this based in this book, and here he says this, and somebody else says, well, I don't have that one, but I've got this one, and he doesn't say that, what's the believer to understand unless they have all of them together and can see chronologically how his views are evolving, how he's changing. People change, they revisit things. Intellectuals, that's what we're supposed to do. And it wasn't really until the later Safavid period, 1640s or so on, that you began to have access to rediscovered manuscript copies of some of these very early texts, which went missing. I mean, the fifth great book of the early four books among the Shia and the Buyid period is gone. Sheikh Saduq's Minhaj al-Ilm, gone. Okay. Other texts have disappeared along the way. Alamea's Hilli's had a big Rijal book, of which we only have the Khalasa. The Khalasa of what? Well, we don't have it any longer. So things did disappear there. But by the time you got then to the later Safavid period and you were getting copying going on, mainly in Iran, and you were getting a recompilation of hadiths by the three Muhammads who are Amili, Baqir al-Majlisi, and Faiz al-Kashani, you then found that these books were coming back in and people were using the hadith to understand the nature of the faith now that it finally had a home. So I'm kind of, in my Safavid work, that's kind of the sorts of material I'm interested in, have been interested in. And also understanding this again as responses, things that have a subtext. And so the idea is to try and find what that subtext is. To whom did the compiler or the author feel he was talking? And inferring that from the text itself, because we don't know. The subalterns in that period, nobody had a microphone or a camera to say, what do you think? So you try and best you can to try and find out what people are saying by looking at the things that were written to and for them. So that's kind of where I'm working on now.